My name is Alexander Bošković, and I'm co-director of East Central European Center here at Harman Institute. And I'm very happy to welcome you to the second webinar of our five-part series called East Central Vanguard. And I will say just few things about the series in general, and I will then turn over to my colleague and co-director, Christopher Harwood, who will introduce today's speaker. So, as I said, this is today's second installment of our five-part series, which we started in late February, almost a month ago, with a lecture by Alexander Chiriac, who focused on Romanian avant-garde. Today, we are reconvening and continuing the series with lectures on Czechoslovakian, and then we'll follow on Hungarian and Yugoslav avant-garde in the next few weeks, on March 30th and April 6th, to be more precise. And then we will conclude the series with our last lecture on April 20th with a presentation on Polish avant-garde. Each of these lectures in webinar series, which are happening on Tuesdays afternoons, is going to be investigating some aspect of avant-garde art from East Central Europe that has been neglected so far to the greater or lesser degree until now. And it is also important to say that we organized this series that runs actually in order to run parallel to the current exhibition in the Museum of Modern Art in New York that is called Engineer, Agitator, Constructor. And this exhibition is conceived around the notion of the reinvention of the artist across the Russia and the Central European avant-gardes. That current exhibition at MoMA is organized around the gift of one of the great private collections of political art, the Merrill Berman collection, which was given to the museum. And the reach of this exhibition is to the large degree limited by the scope of that very collection. And we see our webinar series as a sort of institutional intervention and contribution to the so-called impossible histories of East Central European avant-gardes, to use the term from the title of one of the existing anthologies of the interwar avant-gardes. And in this series, we are expecting to learn a lot, and we are, of course, looking to the presentations and discussions. Most of our participants in the series will be present in the audience, and I will urge everyone in the audience to ask questions. If you are participating through the Zoom, please use Q&A button for asking questions, or if you are looking us at through the YouTube, you can use live chat. So without further ado, I will turn the floor to Christopher Harwood, who will introduce our speaker and her topic.
Thank you, Sasha. It's great to be back in this series. We got off to a terrific start last month, so I'm very excited for the continuation now. And I'm also very happy to welcome today's speaker, Megan Forbes, who is a Columbia alumna from our master's program and is a postdoctoral fellow now in the Leonard A. Lauder Research Center for Modern Art at the Metropolitan, where she's completing a book manuscript that documents the adaptation of new print technologies by the Czech interwar avant-garde in their book and magazine publications. Megan's writings are widely published, and she's received numerous fellowships in support of her research, including a Fulbright to work in Berlin. And she's the sole editor of the publication International Perspectives on Publishing Platforms, Image, Object, Text from Routledge in 2019. And she was co-curator of the exhibition Bauhaus of Huthemos, Intersecting Parallels, and that was at the Museum of Modern Art Library in 2018. And she is a PhD alumna from University of Michigan. I'm very happy to have Megan as part of this program. She's one of the people who seems to move just incredibly fluidly between visual art studies and literary studies, and so I'm very fascinated to hear what she's going to share with us today. So take it, Megan.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's nice to be back at Columbia. And thank you also to Sasha and Carly, all three of you, for all the work you've done in putting this series together. I'm really excited to share with you all some of the performances of Mira Holzbachova. And thank you all for being here. I sincerely hope that you're all hanging in there and keeping well. I want to start with a disclaimer that for the first few minutes, I'll be speaking from a rather disciplinary perspective as it pertains to the Slavic field. But once I get into the main topic at hand, I do think the material I'm discussing has salient resonances beyond this inscribed regional sphere. And I wish I knew who all was out there listening, but hello, thank you, and I hope you'll hang around for comments and share your thoughts with me at the end of this lecture and moving forward over email or whatnot. I also want to explicitly thank my colleagues at the Metropolitan Museum of Art who have read and provided feedback on multiple versions of this text, and that's namely in the Leonard A. Lauder Research Center for Modern Art across 2 years of my fellowship, and also in 2 working groups formed by fellows this year that I participate in on performativity and colonial art networks. And from outside the Met, I especially want to thank Anne Subianto, professor at Baruch College, who's provided essential insights with regards to a discussion of Javanese dance that'll be coming up shortly. And I'm especially indebted to Barbara Bartunkova, with whom I am ever in conversation about this material up until this very morning, and whose invaluable insights have especially informed the section I will be talking about on Madame Europa, but also just in general across this whole paper. We've been in discussion about all of these things. I understand, and Sasha has now also kind of opened up for us a sort of framing for this series, and I just wanted to kind of add my own thoughts on how I understand this series to the function I understand it to be serving. So I understand the title of the series, East Central Vanguard, to suggest the potentially insurgent role of these talks in making an intervention in how we think of the region of Central and Eastern Europe within the context of contemporary conversations in the fields of art history and literary studies, and in particular with that period between the 2 world wars. For me, vanguard here has a twofold meaning. It's about the impetus to use this series to introduce historical figures who have been marginalized within an already marginalized field in an Anglophone Western context, but it's also about platforming scholars and methodologies that are not in the mainstream of the US academic discourse. So I want to thank Aleksandar Bošković in particular for creating this space and offering the platform of the Harriman Institute to facilitate this ongoing conversation. Also, in vein of highlighting the importance of conversation in forming these remarks, I'd also like to note that I've already had the pleasure to some of the issues I'll delve in today in some detail with 2 of the other presenters in this series. And that's Alexandra Chiriac, who is also currently a colleague of mine at the Met and who kicked off this series in February, and also Gabor Dobo at the Kashak Museum, who we'll hear from next week. I also want to note that Gabor is the editor of a volume on Dada in Central and Eastern Europe, in which I've had the opportunity to contribute a chapter from which today's talk really comes out of. So my thanks to him and his colleagues for that publishing opportunity and their editorial feedback as well. So to turn to the figure at the center of today's discussion, Mira Holzbachova also distinctly encapsulates the multiple meanings of vanguard that I've already tried to tease out a bit. She is, to be sure, an example of someone who was left out of histories of the Czech avant-garde. She was a member of Devětsil, which was a group of artists, actors, poets, architects, active in Prague and Brno in the 1920s, and led by Karel Tajge. And, there we go. And Devětsil had its own affiliated theater company, the Liberated Theater, in which Holzbachova danced. And she'd form her own short-lived theater company, NAD, or Nové Avantgardní Divadlo, in 1933. That same year, she traveled to Moscow to perform at the first and only International Olympiad of Revolutionary Theater as an active member in the Communist Workers' Union of Czechoslovak Amateur Theater Actors. And in 1937, she traveled as part of an anti-fascist delegation to Spain. And it was her activities of this sort that ultimately required that she seek exile in the United States during the Second World War. And I'll speak about these activities shortly in greater detail. But I also wanted to give a sense of the breadth of her career that lasted about, her life lasted about 80 years. So to summarize, while in the United States, she spent a large part of her time studying with indigenous communities across the US, and in 1963, published a book on this experience in Czech. Of her time in the US, Hozbachova would write, "How could I understand American culture without the Indians? A culture of humanity belongs to them, a culture of machines to the white occupiers." She framed her wartime experience abroad as herself a citizen of an occupied nation, that is, by the Nazis, and forced to live in exile on land occupied by the United States. When Hozbachova returned to Czechoslovakia at the end of World War II, she continued to work as something of a cultural ambassador during the Stalinist period, resumed her dance career in the 50s, and traveled to such places as Cuba, Egypt, and Eurasia in the 1960s. Besides her status as a woman, whom we've seen routinely written out of history, I suspect it is also her post-war affiliation with the communist government and apparent ability to continue working even through the Stalinist years that have made her an unlikely figure to champion in the post-1989 era, despite the fame she enjoyed in her own day. In this way, too, I suggested as vanguard to argue for reclaiming the history of a female figure who does not nicely fit within the dominant narrative of dissent, which is a category that has been applied to post-war artists and writers working underground and unofficially, and something of a parameter of prestige bestowed on those who worked in resistance to the communist regimes. So in this brief bio, there's already so much to unpack in this complex figure, but as I mentioned previously, for today, I'll focus on Hozbachova's interwar activities and consider what her performances and self-presentation can contribute to discussions of representation and appropriation within a decolonial framework. Through a consideration of Hozbachova's masked, pantomime performances of the 1920s and 30s, I aim to begin to suggest a fuller portrait of a person who has both limited visibility today due to issues of gender, genre, region, and politics, and at the same time clearly enjoyed a level of freedom of movement and self-expression and exploited that towards her own artistic gains. Finally, Hozbachova represents a vanguard for me personally precisely because this is all new material that I have only just begun to work through. She's a person with whom I still have so much to learn, but I aspire to write a full monograph on her at some point. A girl can dream. For now, what I can offer here is something of a show and tell that offers a glimpse of Hozbachova's rich archive and a series of notes and interrogations that I hope to continue to work through in dialogue perhaps with those of you here today. And finally, I want to highlight that I was so fortunate to have the opportunity to first actually visit her archive in the theater division of the Czech National Museum in June of 2020. Yes, 2020. And for that, I would like to express my utmost gratitude to Krzysztof Vancha. All the materials that I'm referencing here today, and most of the images, including this one, that I'm able to show are thanks to his generous assistance, despite the obvious challenges related to the COVID-19 pandemic. So for the remainder of my time today, I'll focus on 3 moments of Hozbachova's early career. The first pertains to an instance from her time at the Liberated Theater in the 1920s, the second to her anti-fascist dances of the 1930s, and finally on her self-fashioning while in exile in the United States. So the formal relationship between the Liberated Theater and Devět began in 1926 during Jiří Frejka's short directorship at the theater from 1926 to 1927. This was also a season in which Hozbachova was on the bill for a large number of performances. A poster for the January 8, 1926 production at the Theater na Slupi, and this is the one you can see on the left, of Molière's 17th century comedy Georges Dandan, billed in Czech as Circus Dandan, with Hozbachova in the role of Dandan's wife, first clearly associates the theater with Devět. So at the top you see Liberated Theater, Osvobozené divadlo, and then a section of Devět that's running across the top banner. 1 month later, a program for March 11, 1926 was dedicated entirely to Hozbachova. On the poster, She is credited for the evening's choreography and costumes, as well as its staging at Naslupi, for which the full program includes a sacred dance and dance with a mask, dance orchestra, the Madman, a dance parody, and circus. So I'll return to an image that I believe to be connected to that performance momentarily, but briefly, I just want to highlight Hozbachova's central role within the Liberated Theater and Deviatzil by pausing on this photo montage found in her archive by Antonin Haitum, which makes use of the theater posters that we've just seen in the last slide, as well as various photos of Hozbachova herself. And as you can see here, the montage was then printed on the cover of the Deviatzil magazine Pasmo, and the original was also hung in the 1926 Deviatzil exhibition at the House of the Artists in Prague, alongside a cast of Hozbachova's leg, which I don't have time to get into here, but I do discuss in greater volume in the Dada volume that I mentioned in greater detail. In the poster for the March 11th Hozbachova evening at the Liberated Theater, her sacred dance and dance with a mask is added with the description Debussy and Javanese motifs. In the encoded Sirabon Mask, Laurie Margot Ross writes that the French composer Claude Debussy was introduced to the gamelan music and dance of Java at the 1889 Paris Exposition Universelle. While Margot Ross maintains that it is debatable how much this influenced Debussy's music, there is little doubt that his work prefigured the atonal avant-garde music of the 1920s, end quote. And here we see that Debussy's music has made it to the stage of the Liberated Theater in the 1920s. Hozbachova's archive offers this photograph that possibly suggests how Debussy's purportedly Javanese motifs were reflected in her performance. In the photograph, we see Hozbachova in a painted mask, costume of sheer black fabric, and stylized pose, which, however, does not appear to be within the repertory of Javanese dance. And for this, I especially thank Anne Subianto as well as Amalia Suryani of Sang Budaya Dance for their consultation on this image. The pantomime performance of seemingly imagined Javanese motifs can be considered as complicit with contemporary colonial tropes of avant-garde making and performance prevalent across Europe at the time. The dance cannot be understood as reenactment, which would suggest direct exposure to an original that Hozbachova is not likely to have had. But its evocation of a non-European, ostensibly Javanese subject suggests how colonial appropriation found its way into avant-garde performance even in countries with no colonies. In the history of Dada, which is generally said to have its birthplace in Zurich, the mass performances at the Cabaret Voltaire and Galerie Dada are well known. Perhaps Hugo Ball's demonstrations and Sophie Teuber's abstract dances most of all. While much has been written on the Zurich Dada performances and the masks created for them, typically by the Romanian Marco Iancu, what is largely lacking from discussions of Dada performance that incorporate the mask is a recognition of the violence wrought by these European actors towards an imagined other. While the recent Dada Africa exhibition and its catalog, for instance, clearly traces African influences in the art of Dada, or, in the case of these mass dances, acknowledges a lack of real influence or understanding at all, a sustained discussion of the potentially problematic nature of this reception is generally lacking. The creation, utilization, and discussions around these masks in their time are evidence today of colonial methods of cultural appropriation, what Delilah Scruggs recently called the European avant-garde's exoticizing notions of Africa. In the Zurich case, this was indeed often in relation to African culture and reflected more a projection of the white European imagination than any real knowledge or understanding of their stereotyped subject. As Mona de Wert writes in her essay on Dada performance in the Dada Africa catalog, although the protagonists of the Dada movement may have allowed themselves to be inspired by African and non-European models for their artistic creations, these notions did not stem from personal travel experiences, but came from travel stories told by Jan Ephraim, the landlord of the Mayorai, Cabaret Voltaire, who knew Africa well, or were projections and reproduced cliches. Still, she does not go so far as to condemn these practices outright, and the question I am posing here is whether they ought to be. Additionally, while Dada performance is often associated with the legacy of the so-called grotesque, what Elsa Adamovich writes, quote, push the grotesque genre to its limits, end quote, problematic racialized notions of the grotesque as presented in the mass Dada performances is almost wholly absent, or even suggested as a mode of subversion to colonial rule by white European subjects. The bodily performance of the grotesque was, according to Adamovich, quote, a subversive force at the heart of Dada's revolutionary politics. Reviling the classical body, they celebrate the grotesque as an act of resistance to official hierarchies and norms, end quote. She takes this so far as to claim that the photomontages in Berlin Dadaist Hannah Höchst series from the Ethnographic Museum, which cut and paste white female body parts with African sculpture, are, quote, grotesque insomuch as they collapse binary structure, classical grotesque, undo hierarchies, the African in the service of the European, and celebrate materiality, end quote. While Adamovich argues that Höchst is, quote, denying the appropriation, the colonization of both the female and non-European other, end quote, she does not seem to consider in this statement the implications of Höchst's positionality as a white German woman in cutting up objects that have been brought to Europe from Africa via colonial plundering. Maud Levine's contention already in 1993 that Höchst was using these photomontages to make an argument for the liberation of the Weimar-era New Woman feels closer to Höchst's original intention. And while Levine does not necessarily put it in these explicit terms, by my reading, this is at the expense of a careful consideration of the African objects and their cultures which were utilized in Höchst's collages. So returning to Holzbachowa's dance of the Javanese motifs, I then ask, how can we read this image in which the other is performed by a figure who spoke later in explicitly anti-colonial language and comes from a country with no real imperial holdings? This is a question I'm continuing to work through, but for now, I offer this case study from Holzbachowa's oeuvre as a possible foil to Dada performances such as those at the Cabaret Voltaire, where the latter has received ample art historical attention and Holzbachowa's dances have not been discussed at all. The process of thinking through their interpretation now offers a fresh lens for asking how the Czechoslovak avant-garde adapted and internalized exoticizing practices in its art making and performance, but also considering how this might help to advance more critical discussions of Western Dada artists. And in service of this, offering one other example, I want to briefly mention this image, which was recently brought to my attention by Przemysław Strożek. This archival photograph appears in the catalog for the Museum Sztuki exhibition Enrico Pampolini, Futurism Stage Design, and the Polish Avant-Garde. In it, the dancer Erwina Kupferova is shown in costume for the Italian futurist F.T. Marinetti's Fire Drum, which had the subtitle African Drama of Fire, Color, Rumble, Fragrance, which was performed in Prague in 1922, alongside the publication of its Czech translation. Here, we have a slightly earlier example than Holzbachowa's Javanese motifs of a performance of the now explicitly African other that likewise is directly connected to international contact and influence, here in this case with the Italian futurists. And there's a very fraught relationship between Deviatzil and the futurists. Marinetti came to Prague in 1921. Taiga was not impressed, but then they later do a special issue of their magazine Red dedicated to him and so forth, but I don't have time to get into all that here. Kupferova was affiliated with the Dalkross School in Hillerau, outside of Dresden in Germany, where Holzbachova would also study. And this photograph, presumably of her, by her husband František Drtiko, dressed as a harlequin, helps bring me back around to a more sustained discussion of the employment of Holzbachova of the tradition of pantomime and the grotesque. The critic, Miroslav Rutte, in an article from 1925 titled Liberated Dance, situates the place of the grotesque in Holzbachova's work, writing that, quote, she has dedicated so much attention to grotesque dance because grotesque is the natural expression of our skeptical and yearning age. She has shown the parody of the dying swan, mocking, daring to the verge of triviality, with a fierce humor and a technical charm, half clown, half girl, and somewhere along the way in accord with the hearty humor of Chaplin." End quote. This summary underscores a notion of the grotesque as it operated in the interwar period, much like Adamovich's description, as a performative rebellion towards an emancipatory politics. I find this use of the grotesque to be more salient, actually, in Holzbachowa's work of a decade later than Rutte's review, encapsulated in her appropriation of the Harlequin figure towards anti-fascist pantomime in the 1930s. Holzbachowa's pantomime performances were connected to her political engagement, for which she often embodied the figure Harlequin, a popular, originally male character of the Commedia dell'arte tradition, commonly described as an enigma, a servant, and a gesture, who would subvert power, who was able to subvert those with power over him. As a person of the people, the Harlequin would have been an appealing model for Holzbachowa, and the dancer appears frequently dressed in a diamond-shaped costume that references Harlequin's typical garb. Again, Holzbachowa had traveled to Spain in 1937, where she served as part of an anti-fascist delegation during the Spanish Civil War, and first performed her dance Madame Europa. When she performed it in Paris a year later, the program notes, of which this is the cover, describe the plot of the dance as such. Quote, "Europe was all-powerful. She ruled and commanded the entire world. Poor Europe, you are sick, your nations tremble. What new idea have you found for your good health? Shall the color of brown and black renew your visage? How old and miserable you are." End quote. Specifically, it's the rise of fascism that is making Mother Europe ill, referenced obliquely in this quotation by the brown and black shirts of German and Italian soldiers, respectively. As mentioned at the outset of this paper, Holzbachowa's anti-fascist stance ultimately eventuated her exile to the United States. In an article published there by a Cleveland newspaper, Holzbachowa explains at length the plot of Madame Europa, in terms that echo the Paris program notes and include added context. And this is a quote, "Europe suddenly discovers she is losing her charm and is growing weak. She is ill, poisoned by a new and mysterious malady, and her nerves are shattered. She does not stop at the first signs of illness when, through force, a free nation, Ethiopia, is subdued. Helplessly, in a last fit, she wishes to save herself by sacrificing freedom and democracy for an injection of barbarian force, Nazism and fascism. It didn't help. Ugly, old, leprous, and corrupted, she looks in dismay at the future." End quote. The evocation of illness in both of these descriptions of the dance resonates strikingly with the post-war reflections of Aimé Césaire in Discourse on Colonialism, first published in 1950, in which he states, quote, "No one colonizes innocently, no one colonizes with impunity either. A nation which colonizes, a civilization which justifies colonization, and therefore force, is already a sick civilization, a civilization which is morally diseased, which irresistibly, progressing from one consequence to another, one denial to another, calls for its Hitler, I mean its punishment." End quote. Césaire, who was living in Paris at the time of Holzbachowa's performance, describes in Discourse, in the words of Robin D.G. Kelly, how, quote, "colonialism works to decivilize the colonizer." End quote. In Madame Europa, Holzbachowa audaciously dances under the name of a whole continent as she performs its atrophy and decay wrought by this punishment of its Hitler. And while the descriptions of Holzbachowa's dance would seem to equate colonization with good health and marks its decline into sickness only with the rise of fascism, Césaire articulates clearly that its imperial might was already a source of its moral and physical demise, and fascism an inevitable outcome. Various photographs and accounts illustrate the transformation of Madame Europa before and after she is overcome by fascism. For the piece, Holzbachowa danced in her harlequin costume, with a black veil and makeshift black crown on her head, as you can see in this image. And then, once she has been overtaken, she dons a mask, bearing a deformed white face, reminiscent of the painted clown faces popular with Jiří Voskovec and Jan Werch at the Liberated Theater, but now rendered frightening as the mouth sounds laughed, as if in an anguished, slow-motion scream. In the context of Commedia dell'arte, it was Pierrot who had a white mask or painted face, and Harlequin typically wore a black or brown leather mask. Some scholarship has linked Harlequin's black mask to the possibility that the character was intended to be of African descent, and it has been persuasively argued that he is a precursor to the racist trope of blackface in the 19th and 20th centuries. While I have not found archival evidence that indicates clearly that this would have been her original intention, Hozbachova's choice to render the face of inhabited by fascism as a white-faced harlequin does invite an interpretation of her work that references the whiteness of Europe as an element integral to its imperial violence. At any rate, we can understand the mask to be employed here as a mode of condemnation vis-a-vis the brutality of war. During the 1930s, another kind of mask also began to feature on the Czech stage, the gas mask. In photographic documentation of a Liberated Theater performance of Caesar, already in 1932, just a year before Adolf Hitler would be appointed German Chancellor, a line of female dancers wear well-fitted military uniforms, their faces covered in gas masks, right arms raised towards the Caesar in what resembles a Nazi salute. In Hozbachova's 1938 performance, a dance is included in the program with the title Attaque de Gaz, or Gas Attack, that carries the description, quote, "The air is saturated with death. We want to live. Our faces are green and yellow. My child, do you recognize your mother? You also, you want to live. We kill war so that the people may live." End quote. Now, the faces that were threatened by the black and brown colors of fascist military might have become green and yellow from the effects of chemical poisoning. Photographic documentation of this dance suggests that Hozbachova herself did not don a gas mask, nor any mask, for this performance. Rather, she is clothed in the dark funereal garb of a full-length skirt and long sleeves, her hair covered in a headscarf of the same material. One such image appears, and this is the one we're looking at now, in an issue of Pestrý týden from 1938 that also includes scenes from Madame Europa and another dance entitled simply Germany, in which Hozbachova is actually dressed as a brown shirt herself, all illustrating a text authored by her in which she reflects on her time in Spain and the devastation she witnessed there. In a photograph from the gas attack dance, Hozbachova stands with her arms jutted straight out before her, crossed at the wrists, as though they are in shackles. It is not long after her return to Czechoslovakia from Spain that she would leave again, ultimately arriving in the United States in 1939. A new look for Mira Hozbachova. Since I've taken us through so many examples of the different figures that Hozbachova embodied towards different ends in her interwar performances, I want to briefly close with the consideration of one last character, which she took on in exile. While in the United States, she danced under the name Mira Slovanika. Already, a clipping from a UK paper dated December 21, 1938, offers evidence that Hozbachova gave performances there en route, and her program is described in one review as beginning with, quote, national dances, which proceeded to the international and topical and ended with character interpretation, end quote. In a clipping from another issue of Pestrý týden, which reports on Hozbachova's time in England, her kroj, or traditional dress, here, is identified as from the region of Slovatsko, or Moravian Slovakia, near to Kroměříž, where Hozbachova was born. In the US press, her pantomimic sketches, as they're called, are named as the reason for her exile from a, quote, Nazi-ridden Europe. And the United States is described as, quote, her refuge from Nazi wrath, end quote. Herself now a foreigner in a land that might know little of her home country, Holzbachova performed as something of a generalized Slavic subject, in folk costume specific, however, to her own background, and she did perform for Czech communities, as in Cleveland. In this instance, we see her taking on a sort of cultural appropriation of the self, if such a thing can be said to exist, in order to somehow make visible and sell her work and her dance in the United States. A sense of Holzbachova's alienation in the United States comes through profoundly in this last image I'll share today. This was Holzbachova's holiday greeting in the form of a photograph taken of herself on the beach in Miami. Almost as an alter ego to the character she embodied in Gas Attack, Holzbachova is captured here cloaked in white from head to foot. Unlike the black dress and head covering worn in Gas Attack, the material of this costume is an ethereal fabric that billows behind her as Holzbachova walks along the shoreline, her arms unbound and open wide. Etched into this dark sky are the words War Christmas, 1942. It is, however, not a happy greeting, but rather a haunting. Holzbachova has become a walking ghost. In the darkroom, her face has been burned out of the photograph. Not so much a mask as a total nothingness, an eerie hollow. On the backside of a copy of the photograph held in her archive, Holzbachova has written, quote, "I removed the face so that it became a symbol, the beautiful figure of Christmas which loses its sense of humanity, loses its face, if war and death wander the earth." End quote. Through this whirlwind tour of Holzbachova's archive, I hope to have traced some of the discrete moments in her early career and presented them alongside a consideration of how these images relate to self-fashioning, appropriation, and agitational politics in the interwar period. Clearly, there's much work left to be done in understanding Holzbachova's history, which has not yet been written, and thinking through its implications for a broader discussion on how decolonial methodologies can apply to the region of Central Europe. I hope to continue this conversation now in the Q&A and in further discussions to come. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Megan. I think you've done a great job of pitching that book project. This talk opens so many questions about the figure of Mira Holzbachova herself, but also so many issues that are important for the avant-garde in a broader sense. These concerns with cultural appropriation, colonialism, the specific response to fascism, and all the complicated ways that that's going to hit different parts of Europe at different times in the 1930s. And then, of course, the tease here with the American phase, which raises so many more questions. So I'm going to encourage our audience to send their questions into the Q&A function if you're with us on Zoom, and into the live chat if you're with us on YouTube. But I'll take the chance to drop the first question or two. The Javanese dance comes out. Was it in 26?
If that's indeed the photograph that corresponds to that dance at the Liberated Theater, it would be 1926.
The first thing that came to mind is it's close to the timing of Konstantin Bibel's trip to Indonesia. And I'm wondering, I think he came back in 27. And so, it wasn't like he could have brought her, I guess, any direct inspiration if she was already performing this in 26. So I just wonder, whether there is a connection, whether they ever met and talked about Java or things like that.
Yeah, that's something I'm really curious about as well. I don't think, okay, so if this dance was actually performed in 26, it couldn't have been in response to Bibel's travel. But I am really interested in his poetry collections that come out after his return, starting in 27. And that's something I've been wondering about, is if they had any communication. Certainly they were both in the same circle. And Taiga was very active in the book design, and doing the typographic layouts and so forth for that book. But yeah, in terms of them having a conversation, I haven't encountered that so far,
Yeah,
but I'm very curious about that as well.
great. Curious too about the timing of her arrival in the States, and it, her appearance in that kroje, in that traditional Moravian Slovak outfit in '39. The timing is really close to the famous World's Fair exhibition that the Czechoslovaks in New York carried on even after they'd lost their country. And I was wondering if there was any, if she was aware of that exhibition, if she appeared at it, and if her taking on this kind of Slavic goddess persona was in any way connected explicitly to the mission of that Czechoslovak exhibition in New York.
That's such a great question. If she was somehow involved with the World's Fair, I don't know. I haven't. That has not been something that I've encountered in the clippings or that are reporting on her time in the United States. But that would be a really fascinating, another very fascinating aspect of her kind of U.S. tour, if she was involved with that in any way.
Mhm.
Okay.
Like, if I can jump in, thank you
Yeah.
so much for this wonderful presentation. I think you succeeded to say so much in such a short period of time. So congratulations again. I really enjoyed it. Um, I'm already seeing there are some questions coming in our chat, so maybe I'll start with them, and if we have time, I can say a few. I can ask my own questions as well. So our previous presenter, Alexandra Chiriak, asks, could you tell us a bit more about Holzbachova costumes? It sounds like she was responsible for the concept and design of the costumes in some of the performances you mentioned. Is that the case? And did she have any notable stage design collaborators?
Thank you. Yeah, so let's see. I'll start with the costumes. Yes, she was doing her costume design, working on stage design as well, and choreography. She had her own dance school in Prague at the same time, and was sort of like, I think, using the Liberated Theater as a way to advertise her dance school. Um, and you can see, at the same time, advertisements for her dance school for young children and so forth. Um, and so, yeah, she was really involved in every aspect of the dance production. Um, and then to the second part of the question, remind me, Sasha, what was the
Did
second?
anyone
Yeah.
Collaborate with her that you're
Oh,
aware of
yes,
on
yes, thank
stage
you.
design or?
Yes.
Mhm.
So Antonin Haitum was one of the stage designers at the Liberated Theater who did that photo montage that we saw early on. And another major collaborator of hers at the Liberated Theater, not necessarily on stage design, but was Adolf Hofmeister, who together with Antonin Haitum, and I didn't show any images of this, although you could see it very tiny in the poster of her special night at the Liberty Theater. They designed her logo, which is this sort of like torso that's kind of moving around an axis and creating this schematized harlequin sort of figure in the logo there. So
It
thanks
sounds
for
like
that.
a Bauhaus school of dealing with the subject. Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting. Uh-huh.
And also
There,
looking to the Laban school, there's like a lot of connection between that logo and some of his notation. But yeah.
mhm. And maybe to follow up, when you mentioned dance school, how much of a dialogue her school of dancing had with other kind of schools that were present at the moment in Central East Europe?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting that not just Holzbachova, but Kuferova, who I showed a image of, Milcha Mayarova, and many of the other dancers at the Liberated Theater had studied at the schools that I named the Del Cross School in Hellerau in my talk, and then just now the Laban School. Uh, most of them studied with both of these schools and then brought back this pedagogy to Prague. So this dance reform or this expressionist dance movement that kind of comes out of Germany, I guess you could say, really finds its way onto the avant-garde stage in Prague through these women who started as students dancing abroad in these schools and then coming back as teachers themselves. And people like Miroslav Ruta, who the critic I mentioned, are reporting very much so like on their studies abroad and the schools that they're starting and their sort of own interpretation of this larger like Central European dance reform movement.
Mm-hmm. And this is happening at the same time when Taige is coming from Russia. Was there any input from the Russian schools of theater of action or?
Well, certainly at the Liberated Theater, Meyerhold and Tyrov are very big. I don't know if the right word is. I always kind of pause before I want to say influence, but they were in an exchange certainly, and I mean certainly influence. In Antonin Heitum's stage designs for the Liberated Theater are very much like explicitly stated by Taige to be in conversation with Meyerhold, for example. And yeah, so certainly, and also I wanted to say on that note, and I didn't show an image of this, but also at the Liberated Theater, Hozbachova has a dance of the Internationale, which she had used as a way to. There was like a celebration of like a communist celebration at which she was invited to dance, and they wanted to play the Internationale. And she recounts later in like a radio interview, I think in the 70s, that that they weren't allowed to play the song, but she was allowed to pick any music for her dance that she wanted. So she chose it to play for her dance as a way, as like an intervention, and that was like in 26 or 7. Really after Taige had come back from Moscow in 25, in end of 25.
So Chris, we have maybe other questions.
Yeah. You got it. I got it.
you should go in.
Yeah. Okay, so from Hilary Witham Sanchez. Hi, Megan. Thanks for sharing your research with us today. I'm glad to see you found my work on Dada and issues of colonization that I shared with the 2019-2020 LALRC cohort, Generative for Your Thinking. I have a lot to say about your material, so feel free to reach out. However, I think it's essential to situate Hozbachova's performances in relationship to Black performers in Europe, and specifically the Cuban clown Chocolat, who she references directly in the poster you shared, and also the American dancer Josephine Baker, whose postures and hairstyles she mimics. Thank you.
Hi, Hilary. Sense you out there. So yeah, I remember we talked a bit when I first workshopped this in the end of summer. I was thinking about talking more about Hozbachova's only staging with her own theater company at 33 of Clown Chocolata by Jiří Máchen. And ultimately that isn't something that I have I haven't written on that either in the essay for the Dada catalog or in this for today's presentation, and I showed the poster from that performance early on. I've thought through some of those comments that you made about connecting it to this Cuban performer in the summer, but I haven't sort of found a way to kind of make that a explicit connection with Jiří Máchen's play about a clown. It's sort of more in a kind of communist persuasion who's giving out chocolates to the children of the world. But it is something that we should chat about again at some point.
Okay.
Go ahead, Chris.
Oh, I had another question from the field. Susanna Halsey is curious on some of the biographical details. If you can confirm that she was a member of the Communist Party, and if you know what the timing of that was, And also if you know the details, when and how she managed to leave Czechoslovakia and find, I guess, asylum in the U.S.
Okay, so she went to the United States in the beginning of 1939. She was still in, like, we know she's in the UK in December of 1938 from those articles. And then, so I would presume she was a member of the Czechoslovak Communist Party, but you may have noticed I didn't say that because I'm not 100% sure. I haven't seen that anywhere written. That's not to say it doesn't exist, and it would seem surprising to me that she wasn't. I did this other dancer I talking about briefly today that has just recently come to my attention. Ervina Kuperova, she did join the Communist Party and then immigrated to Ukraine. And I read that I found that written about in a paragraph of a text this morning. But I don't have any such hard evidence yet for Holzbachova.
Okay.
And there was another question by Vladislav Beronia, which is a question more about the methodology and the concept of grotesque that you were talking about. He said he's interested in your discussion of the grotesque as a complicated, ambivalent form, if that's the right word. I'm wondering whether you could say more about the grotesque in relation to notions of purity and hybridity, and how those would relate to a decolonial methodology for this region.
Yeah, thanks, Vlad. Okay, so the notion of the grotesque is something that pops up a lot in the like contemporary descriptions at the time. So like in the Ruta review that I mentioned and so forth, and in relation to this legacy sort of out of this like theater tradition with Commedia dell'arte and so forth. And then, so I referenced that in an earlier draft of this that will be in this Dada volume. And then a current fellow at the Met, Sarah Garzon, had sort of encouraged me to kind of think more about this notion of grotesque and how it does provide perhaps a lens into thinking about these questions around performing the other and so forth that I'm trying to get at in this material. And so I've been doing a lot of more reading on that in the last couple of weeks, and thinking about these kind of issues that you raise, Vlad, and how Dada scholars have used grotesque quite a bit. I've noticed now in talking about Dada performance. But it generally seems to skirt around these issues that I'm trying to talk about with regards to colonial appropriation and or colonial imaginary and so forth.
Yeah, and it's very interesting, if I can follow up to this question, that you mentioned that the context she's coming from does not have any imperial kind of experience and inclination. So that may be also a way to think through the use of grotesque differently.
You're saying because of the fact that there are no, the point I was making around like not having any colonial holdings themselves, Czech. Yeah. And it feels so something that I was talking about just this morning with Barbara is on the other hand, then, is it that they're just sort of appropriating tropes that are coming from France or so forth, and yet that's never been my approach to the Czech avant-garde in my dissertation and so forth, to say that the Czech avant-garde is just copying what's going on somewhere else. It's always been more of a discussion of exchange. So in a way, that would also be a way to let them off the hook, like and I'm not trying to let anyone off the hook.
Fair enough. There is another question back to our discussion that we started the Q&A section. Pepe Kermel is asking, says, remarkable research here, congratulations. How would you position Holzbachova with the international panorama of modern dance? It's something that you already addressed. For instance, in relation to the contemporary narrative and political work of Martha Graham.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really thought of her in the context of Martha Graham, but certainly like in her own time, I think it's more back to these reform schools in Germany, coming from Laven and Delcroix and at Hellerau, are like there. I would say, I mean, are the most notable. You know, Matt Witkovsky also wrote about this in his article on Milcha Majerova. In terms of the Laban school, these are just very notable. And then if you continue to look at more of these female dancers, and of which Holzbachova is only one, there are, you just see that they were all like studying at these schools. More so than any maybe direct contact with what was going on in Zurich or Paris or so forth.
So Alexandra is back on, wondering if you could comment on any links between Holzbachova's Dada performances and her folkloric or national dances and costumes. She says, in the Romanian case, some scholars have tried to link, maybe rather tenuously, the Dada masks with local folk traditions. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how avant-garde artists' interest in the so-called primitive takes on different meanings in an East Central European context.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I showed that image there at the end, not really knowing what to do with it or how to talk. I mean, because I think, Alex, that's like a really interesting, I mean, yeah, that's really interesting. And kind of what I'm trying to think through is like stylistically, like I said, like here's a new look for her, you know, like stylistically, they look so different. And in the working group I'm in right now, I showed so the like those images side by side, the one of the Madame Europa, one of the Javanese motifs, and then that dance of her in the Croix together, and it's all the same person, and they do feel to me like on a continuum, even if like aesthetically it seems different, very different, and also like even in that like UK article, the way they frame it, like these are like national issues versus like international issues. International being like World War II. Um, so yeah, I'm working through that question also, and I'm excited to talk about it with you more because I think you know we're probably working through similar questions in that regard. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would just maybe add that in the case of Yugoslav avant-garde, there is also in the 40s this push towards more nationalist-oriented discourses by the former avant-gardists. So, yeah, putting that in an international context may be a helpful approach. But yeah, if I can go back, I really liked your reading of the Madame Europe and the notion of illness connected with the colonialization. And I'm wondering, you had this wonderful title, Many Masks, and you kind of show this arch from, you know, harlequin through grotesque face to the defacement. Is that the narrative you just wanted to choose for today, or you think that's something that would explain her much longer life, or?
That's a good question. I definitely wasn't thinking of it as an arc to describe her fuller life. And also, I don't know nearly as much about her, the second half of her life. She died in the early 80s, and I really don't know as much about the work she was doing then. There's less of that in the archive. And also, I've spent literally like a few hours racing through the archive in June. I mean, really, it was my last day in Czech Republic before I returned to the United States, and I gave this whole sob story about how if I didn't see these materials now, I never knew when I would. And it was this Krzysztof Vancha, who I mentioned, was very helpful in helping me to get there to Terezin, and I spent 2 hours in the archive taking frantic pictures. Some of them are blurry, so this is really the beginning of this project for me. And I'm sure and I should also stay at the Museum of Czech Literature. They also have materials related to Holzbachova, her CVs and so forth that have been helpful in constructing some of her story. But anyways, that's away from your question, but to say that I really don't know enough about the second half of her life to make that kind of a beautiful, sweeping, like mapping, as you suggest. But I just find that image that I end with so haunting, and thinking about it alongside a discussion of mass. What does it mean to just like be entirely defaced and to deface yourself in that way? And yeah.
I was thinking it is Christmas 42, and I mean, obviously the war is in full swing, but particularly in the Czech context, this is the first Christmas after Lidice. And I wonder if, that really just haunting image, maybe, there's a more specific, impetus to the horror of Lidice in particular and what that meant to the Czech people.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. That makes me just think of like Brecht as poems from, not necessarily related to Lidice, of course, but the poems that he was writing from the beaches of California during the Second World War, and how absurd it felt to be in that paradise when he knew, paradise, but like knew that where he was, had come there from was just ravaged. And so there's something that when you say that, it makes me think, she's there on that beach in Miami, which is could be another such paradise, and then reflecting on this estrangement and in this way that is similarly kind of highlighting, like that alienation. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, at the same time, as you rightly noticed, this eerie hollowness is reminiscent of the surrealism and surrealist art, especially also in Czech context, right, with the Toyen's representations of hollow figures.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I didn't pause on that too long, and nor in this chapter that I've written, because it's specifically for Volume Andata, do I talk too much about the surrealist aspect of that work, but certainly, I think that image that I end with is much more in a surrealist vein. And yeah, Toyen's hollows and so forth are an obvious comparison there for sure.
Susanna Halsey looks like has maybe been doing a little biographical research online and says that as a contributor to Halo and the choreographer Armádní umělecký soubor Vít Nejedlý and the organization Umění lidu, post-war, she definitely was a member of the Communist Party. And I think that's probably, and I was just wondering to latch onto that. I know you've announced that you are just getting into the post-war Holzbachova, but do you have any sense about whether she's right on board from 48 on, and whether there's ever any daylight between her and the regime?
Right. Well, so to those points of like what Susanna Halsey has just brought up, and to your question, I was just double checking in my Taneční slovník this morning, which does have an entry for her, and I wish I had it next to me because I don't want to speak inaccurately. But yeah, it does say like in 1948 she was part of these organizations, and she did this, and so yeah, in that sense I do have like a kind of clear-cut chronology there, but it's one chapter in this slovník, and I mean not one chapter, one paragraph, and like I say, I'm sure in the archive there are more materials. Like there's this great radio broadcast, which I think is from the 70s, where she's talking extensively about her early career, but then it starts to get a little bit hazy after in those specifically those years, late 40s and 50s.
It'll certainly be interesting to find out what she was doing and thinking during and after the Prague Spring, for example.
Yeah, and so I just want to say that I'm also super cautious in how I lay all that out there, because I feel that it would be disingenuous to give a present, and I like in this article I don't get into that at all, but for this purposes I really wanted to just lay it out there, like what I know about that post-war period, because I do think it really reframes how you might think of her versus like this radical avant-garde artist in 1926. But at the same time, because I don't know the full story and I don't know where she stood on the side of things in 68 and so forth, I don't want to throw her under the bus either, because I don't have those answers, and I'm sure there are people who do. I just don't yet. So
that's the responsible thing to do. Another listener is checking in. It's Jarka Svirchev, says, thanks for the great lecture and insights. And she asks, was Holzbachova's dance a means of gender emancipation? Was she active in a feminist scene? Is there a connection with the communist concept of new woman?
Well, yeah, I think like there's certainly like a performance of new woman in her presentation, as well as like Milcha Majerova and so forth. In the text that I've read of her so far, I don't see any self-framing within like a women's emancipation or feminist sort of language, but I think she was just doing that work herself, and many of those other dancers at the Liberate Theater, for example, who were running these schools and very, they were professional, they were independent, and I think that when we think of histories of Deviatzil, which are really just as, and I'm guilty of this too, writing histories of just a bunch of dudes. If you think about the Liberated Theater and you think of all the women dancing there, there is just like a whole other way of talking about the Czech avant-garde, and also in terms of its ability to reach larger audiences. That would be through the theater, perhaps. And so maybe these women were actually the most forward-facing aspect of the Czech avant-garde. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done there, and thinking more about that.
So Helena is checking in, and I think it may be Helena Fischera, has confirmed that indeed she was a member of the party before the war.
Before the war,
Yeah.
Yeah. I would think that. I mean, yes, I would think so. So I'm curious though, when that's coming in, are you seeing that it's written somewhere that she was like a card carrying, or are you gathering that information from these unions and such that she was a part of? Because that's where I just become a little bit nervous about. Yeah.
Innocent until proven guilty, right?
I mean, yeah, it's very telling that she went to Spain at that point. Yeah.
I mean, she went to Cuba. She went, in the 1960s,
Yeah. The shoe probably fits. The other thing that I was wondering is, I mentioned obviously Bibel, that specific connection, but in a broader sense, the exotic and the third world essentially is a huge theme for especially the poetist episode in the Czech avant-garde. And I was just wondering, are you aware of any kind of theoretical, critical work of recent vintage that tries to deal with that, or is it still virgin territory?
You're opening a can of worms now.
Yeah, so...
No, I'm not so aware of much scholarship that's really dealing with these things on a very serious level. So Tomáš Winter has Palmy na Vltavě, or Palms on the Vltava, in which he is kind of offering literally a catalog of various represented, not just also from the Czech avant-garde, but of various representations of, quote unquote primitivism and so forth in the Czech context. And that's now, I don't know how old, but it's by no means like a brand new book. It's not that old though. But this is a conversation I've been having with lots of younger scholars amongst whom are here, I think, like within the context of Central and Eastern Europe, and really wanting to do that work, and not really having a framework within the context of art historical studies from the region, let's say, or literary studies. But as you say, poetism, I mean, it's all there, and surprisingly or not, I don't know. It's not, it doesn't show up very much in the literature.
More work to be done.
Well, maybe for the end, one of the last questions I would have, how, like, it's pretty speculative also, how do you see your project going on forward with this topic?
Well, I'll say today I found out I did not get an ACLS Getty fellowship that I applied to specifically to work on this for the next year. So, and again, this is sort of a can of worms, but like I am in a relatively precarious position. I don't have a tenure track position where I can like sit and write this book project. So I don't know, but it's become something that's really occupied my thinking, and I'm really like invested in this project, and I hope that I can continue it because I've written grant applications with it. I have already like a idea of what this book structure would look like, and I see it as like a potentially important intervention in how we think about like histories, not only of the interwar period but the post-war period, and also alongside other people have done interesting work on questions of like what does it mean to be a dissident artist and dissent in the region. Anyways, so I hope someday to keep working on it.
I'm keeping my fingers crossed for.
I'm holding my thumbs in the Central European manner.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Megan. It is a fantastic topic, and it deserves the kind of treatment that I think you want to give it. So I'm hoping that there will be at some point a sequel to this.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Congratulations again, and thank you for participating in this series. And I'll just invite our audience. Next Tuesday we will continue. We will have our next speaker, Gabor Dobo, who will talk about a case study from Hungarian avant-garde about Jolán Simon, who was a partner of Kasak, much more known Hungarian avant-garde artist. But we are looking forward to it, and I would just invite everyone who is interested to join us for that talk as well.